Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Benjamin. In this video, we're going to be making a resource-based inventory in the Godot game engine. By the end of the video, you'll have something that will look about like this. It will have the basics of an inventory where you can drag and swap items around in this inventory. And these items will be based off of item resources, and we'll get into that. So let's get started. First, you're going to open up Godot and create a new project. Come into this folder here, and I'll call this resource, or we'll just call this inventory tutorial. Create folder. I'm just going to use Godot 3.2. And we're ready to get started. We'll start in the project settings. We'll come to our window. We'll set it to 320 by 180. And we'll set our test width to 720. Let's see. 1280 by 720. We'll set our stretch mode to 2D and our aspect to keep just by default. Now if we come into a 2D scene, we're going to create an inventory container. This will just be a container that we can put our inventory scene in. So we'll do another node. We'll look for a color rect. And we'll set this to take up the full screen. We'll make it black. Then we'll call this inventory container. We'll put a center container node in it like this. Make sure that takes up the entire rect as well. And we'll save here. We'll save this scene, inventory container. So this inventory system uses resources, like I said, as the model for kind of how we're going to structure our code. And so we'll start with the resources. Let's come over here and make a new folder. We'll call this items. And inside this folder, I'm going to copy over some images. And these images come into the folder. Oh, I can't do that. Let's see if I can just drag them in here. And these images are going to be, yep, that seemed to work there. I'll provide a link in the description where you can do that. So we're going to need to, currently they're going to be blurry, so we're going to need to re-import them. So if you click on the image and then you go to presets and then do 2D pixel and then do re-import, it will import that in properly. And then we can do set as default, and then we can re-import in each of these. Did that work? It didn't. We'll select all of them and maybe try 2D pixel re-import. See if it worked. Okay, so I held shift to select them all, then came up here to import presets, switched to 2D pixel, imported them all. Now I'm going to select all of these. Make sure you don't select your background and delete them. We'll come into our scripts, create a new script, and this will inherit from resource, not from node, and we'll call this item.gd. And we'll give it a class name, item, and we can come and give it some properties that we want to be able to define on each item. So we'll start with export string var name, export texture var texture. That doesn't need to have a default. Now that we've created our first script that extends resource here, we can come over into items. And let's actually drag this into items, that script, so it should be here. We can come into items here, right click, do new resource and search item. Now it will show up because of our class name. Because we gave it a class name, it will show up here automatically, we can double click on this and we can make our very first item. We'll make it a sword. So sword.tres. Now if I double click on this sword, we're going to get our properties over here, these variables for this item. We can set the name to sword and we can drag our texture in and set the texture to that. Now we can do this for each of our items. We'll create a new resource. It'll be an item. This one will be potion. And then once I double click on potion, I can name it. And we can give it a image. Let's do that for each one here. Do it for our ring. And one more. Tall shield. Who doesn't want a tall shield, right? Tall shields are the best shields. Okay, so then that allows us to define the different, so each of these resources is a type item, but we're able to define a different name and a different texture. And I may go into this in later videos, but you can add more things like descriptions or how many there are or whatever you want to this base item type. Just clear that there. Okay. So we've got our item resource, and that's good. That's a good starting point. But now what we need is a resource for our inventory. So we're going to create a new script again. And this will also inherit from resource. And we'll call it inventory. We'll give it a class name. And it's not going to have the same properties that we had for items because, well, in this case, we're only going to have one. Technically, there might be a situation where you would have more than one inventory, but in our situation, we're just going to have one. But this data here, this inventory class, is basically going to have, its main job is going to be holding the collection of items, which will just be an array that we have it set to, and then signaling out whenever one of those items gets changed. So we'll have the data that will hold the items, and then we'll signal out whenever an item gets changed. That way our UI can properly update based on whatever changes were made. So we'll start with our signal. This signal will be items changed, and it will take an argument called which is going to be an array called indexes. So that will just list off the different items that were changed. So we might have multiple items changing at once, and so we want to send out a signal saying, okay, item 0 and item 5 both got changed, so update those accordingly. Then we'll have our export array, and it will be resources, and we'll say var items. And this is, this is going to be just a 1D array. Now, a lot of people are like, well, but at the start you showed that your items you had 9 item slots and they were in a grid, right? And yeah, most of the time you would want to use a 2D array for your grid. However, Godot's grid container node actually just uses a list of child nodes. So it's not set up in any sort of a 2D array. It's basically a single array. So it's actually beneficial for us to use a 1D array, just a single array in this case. And we're going to have 9 items and they're all just going to be null for now by default. Let's see, how many am I at there? 7? Okay, I think that's 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Perfect. Now, our inventory is going to have 3 different functions here. So the first one will be set item. And this will just take an item index and an item that we want to set. And we'll just do pass for now. We'll have a swap items. This will take an item index and a target item index. And we'll have a remove item. And this will take an item index. I'm going to check real quick just to make sure my audio seems to be working properly. It looks like it does. It looks like it is. Hopefully it's the right microphone and such. Okay. So this will obviously just remove an item from the inventory. So let's start with set item because it's the easiest. Var previous item equals items item index. So this is saying, okay, when we set an item, there might actually be another item there already. So let's store that real quick. So we'll grab the item that might already be there. Then we'll say items item index equals item. So there we go. We're setting the new item, right? We're taking this and setting it to this index. Then we're going to emit a signal, emit signal, items, item changed. That's items. It's supposed to be items changed. Items changed. And in this case, we only have the one item that is changed. So we're just going to do an array and it will be item index. But make sure it's still an array. Even though there's only one item, this still needs to be an array. Okay. And finally, the last thing we'll do is return the previous item. So as we're accessing the API for our inventory here, like as we're using this function, we may want to have the item that was there before and do something with it. So we can return that back out just in case we want to do something with it. Now let's do remove items. It's actually remove item. It's actually really similar. So we're going to actually copy paste this here. So previous item, that's the same, but when we set it, we just set it to null now. And then we emit the signal again, and then we return the previous item. So when they remove an item, they also get access to the item that was there, just in case they want to do something with it. Now we'll do swap items. Var target item equals items target item index. So we're getting our target item. Var item equals items item index. So we get the first item. So we're getting our target and our first item. Makes sense. Now we're going to swap them. Items target item index equals item, and items item index equals target item. There we go. So we've swapped them now. And finally, we want to emit our signal. Emit signal items changed. And then our array needs to contain both our item index and our target item index, because they both got changed. And that's it. That's our inventory. Now we need to come into our resources over here, do new resource, look up inventory, and we'll just name this inventory.tres. Now we have our inventory set up. Let's clear this. Don't know what that was about. Okay, we have our inventory container scene here, and we have, it's our center container here. So now we need to create an actual inventory display. And this will be a scene that will display our inventory. We'll create a new scene here. We'll go to other nodes and we'll search for grid container. Grid container seems like a good pick for an inventory, right? For an inventory display. And we'll name this inventory display. We'll set its layout to take up the entire screen. And we'll save this scene. Okay, once we've done that, we're going to create another scene here. This will be our inventory slot. So we'll do a user interface node here. Oops, let's change that one actually. Just delete it. Other node, and this one will be a center container. And it will also take up the entire screen. Let's do full rect here. And we're going to give it inventory slot display. We'll give it a name called inventory slot display. And we'll give it a texture rect. Texture rect. And that will actually display our inventory item. And this texture rect, let's start by giving it an item here. We'll drag a potion in here just to display that. And we want to give it a minimum size. So we're going to come into and we'll give it into our rect here on the texture rect, and you'll set we'll actually name this item texture rect. There we go. And you'll set the min size to be 18 and 18. And the reason we're doing this is to make sure that even if the sprite image here is smaller, it still displays on an 18 by 18 grid. That will help our inventory be consistent and uniform. So that's our min size there. And we'll do stretch mode. Does this matter? I don't think stretch mode matters. We'll just leave it what it is for now. Actually, it does matter. It does matter. And here's why. We'll save this inventory slot display. We'll come into, I need to open up, I forgot to grab one of the resources here, so I'm going to grab that real quick. And this, you'll already have this resource. But we need the empty inventory slot. Drag that over. Empty inventory slot. Looks good. Okay. Okay, so now we can see what an empty inventory slot is going to look like. We'll select this. We'll drag an empty inventory slot. You can see it's clear up here in the corner. The min size did fix it. See, if we didn't have min size on, then it would be too small here. So we did fix the min size, but we need the stretch mode to be keep centered. That way it'll stay in the center like that. Okay. Now, if we come into our inventory display, we're going to have 3 columns because we're going to have 9 inventory slot displays. So let's do that. We'll click on our instance scene here. We'll do inventory slot display, and then I can just click on this and do Control D. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times to duplicate it. And that will give us our 9 inventory slots. However, they're clear up here in the corner. We don't want them to do that. So if we come into our inventory slot display here and we click on our center container, we want to set our size flags to be expand horizontally. If you come back here, well, we got to save probably. Come back here, you can see they expanded horizontally now. And then vertically, we want expand as well. Now they'll expand out vertically. So they take up as much space as they possibly can. Then we'll do our inventory display, and we'll set our custom constants to be 0 and 0 here. And that just means that they'll always have the smallest possible distance between them when it's cramped, when it's like condensed down. So now if we take our inventory display and we come into our center container here for the inventory container, and we instance our inventory display in here, you can see that it gets compressed all the way down. That's because it's inside of a center container, but it takes up as much space as it can with each of these inventory slots being 18 by 18. So the min size here in here, if we actually remove this, you can see that our inventory gets really tiny and doesn't have enough space. That's why the min size here is so important to set this to 18 by 18. That's the minimum size that our inventory slot can possibly be. Can't be smaller than that. And that gets this nice looking inventory. Again, we should be able to run our game, select our inventory container scene, and get this visually. So that's pretty cool. So we've started working on the UI that will display the data that we created. All right, let's look at our data here. So our inventory, if we click on our inventory.tres, has an array, but all of these are empty. So let's start by setting, let's give us a sword and a couple potions maybe. We'll drag in a couple potions here, and we'll do a diamond ring, and we'll do our tall shield. We put it here, maybe farther into our inventory. So we just set some items in our inventory here. Let's run the game, and nothing happens. We're not seeing those items in the inventory. Why is that? Well, because our inventory display isn't actually connected to the inventory. So that's what we have to do now. So let's attach a script to our inventory. We're going to have a script for our inventory slot display and our inventory display. So let's attach two scripts. One to our inventory display and one to our inventory slot display. Okay. Let's start with our inventory slot display. And we're going to create a small little function here called display item, or maybe update display. Now let's call it display item. I like that. And it will take an item. And all we'll do is we'll say if item is item, so make sure that's not null. Then we need to get access to our item texture rect. So on ready var item texture rect equals item texture rect. Then we'll say item texture rect dot texture equals item dot texture. Else item texture rect dot texture equals load, and then we'll do the empty inventory slot.png like that. Okay. Might be good to preload this, but for now we'll just do this. So now we have a display item function inside of our inventory slot display. Now we'll come into our inventory display. Inside of here, we need to get access to our inventory resource. We can do this by preloading it. And we'll grab inventory.tres. So that will load this inventory data into our script here so we can do stuff with it. And the first thing we want to do is in our ready function, we want to connect to the items changed. Inventory.connect items changed self, and we'll connect to a function called on items changed. Now let's write that function. It will take indexes, and that will just be our array of indexes, right? We'll say for item index in indexes update. Well, and we got to write some functions here. So let's write a couple new functions that we're going to need. The first one we're going to need is update inventory slot. Slot display. Item index. It'll take an item index. This function will just update a very specific inventory slot display. So var inventory slot display equals get child item index. So that will get the inventory slot display that corresponds to the item in the inventory. Var item equals inventory dot items item index. That gets the item that corresponds to the item index that we got passed in for this function. Inventory slot display dot display item. And we use the function that we created right here to properly display this item in this inventory slot display. Now we can call our update inventory slot display, and we can pass in our item index. So whenever an item changes, right, it will call this function that will update it basically just says, oh, did the data change? Update the display accordingly, according to the data, so that it matches properly with the data. We're going to create another function here, update inventory display for item index in inventory dot items dot size. This is going to loop through the entire inventory, update inventory slot display item index, and it will update every single one of them. So that's something we want to do that right when the game starts. Update inventory display. That way, right when our inventory display loads, it checks. It loops through every single item in the inventory and updates each display slot. So it updates the display to match the data. Now if we run our game, we should see, and we do see here, that our inventory is being properly displayed. And if we go change that inventory here, so let's say we have another tall shield, for example, maybe we put a potion at the end. So we make some changes and run that. We now see those changes reflected inside of our inventory display here. It looks good. Now for dragging and dropping the items around. We're going to use Godot's built-in drag and drop functions that relate to control nodes. And so the first thing we need to do is inside of our inventory slot display, we also need to get access to our inventory. Inside of inventory slot display here, we're going to have var inventory equals preload and then load the inventory.tres. Next, we need to have a function called get drag data. This function takes a position, but I don't use this position. So I just put an underscore at the start so we don't get a warning there. We're just going to do pass for now. And we need another function, can drop data. Also takes a position that I'm not going to use. Also takes data. We will be using that. Pass. And finally, we'll have a drop data function. And this will take a position that we won't use and a data that we will use. Looks good, right? These are functions built into Godot inside of the control nodes, and you can actually look them up in the documentation if you want to read a little bit more about them. I'm going to show you how to use them and kind of explain them in this video, but there is, it might be good to kind of supplement the video with the documentation. Might give you a better idea of how everything's going to work. So first, let's do can drop data, because this is the easiest one. This tells Godot whether this UI, this control node can accept drop data. Okay? And drop data is usually passed as a dictionary. I don't think it has to be actually, but I usually do a dictionary. That's kind of what they show in the documentation. So we'll say return data is dictionary and data dot has item. So this function will return true, telling Godot that this can accept drop data if the data is a dictionary and the data has an item in it. So we know that the drop data is for an item. Pretty easy. Now let's do our drop data right here. This is the function that actually drops the data into our control node. So we'll say var my item index. We'll start by getting our own index. Var, well, let's not handle dropping the data until we gather it. Even though getting the drag data is a little bit more complicated, I do want to do it first because then the drop part will make more sense. So first we need to get an item index for the current inventory slot we're on. So that we can just use get index. This is actually the index of the inventory slot relative to the others here, but it corresponds with the index in our inventory. It'll be the same one. Once we do that, we can get the item. Inventory dot remove item index. Now remember how our remove item actually returns the item out? We're going to store it here now. We're removing it from the inventory and storing it inside of this variable. If item is item, that's essentially a check to make sure that it's not null. If this is null, then we don't want to do anything with it. Var data. We'll create an empty dictionary here. And we'll say data.item equals item. So that will create a new key in our dictionary, and it will store the item in that key, which then makes this work right here because it will have an item. Data.item index. Now we also want to remember the index that the item was in, and that's going to be the index that we just got it from right here. And we're remembering that in case we accidentally drop this item somewhere else, we can return it back to where it was before. So that's going to be in our data too. Now you could just return data here, but it wouldn't show anything when you were dragging the item around. The mouse would just be, the item would be there, but it wouldn't visually show anything. So how are we going to visually show something? Well, there's a function called setDragPreview, and we're going to use that, but it takes a control node as an argument that will be dragged around in the room. So we'll have to create one, and we'll use a texture rect for this. So var drag preview equals texture rect.new. So create a new texture rect. Drag preview dot texture equals item.texture. Since we have access to the item here, we can grab its texture and make that the drag preview texture. And then we can call set drag preview drag preview, pass in the drag preview. Okay. So we get our item, we make sure it's an item, we create some data, it gets removed from the inventory, right? Then we set a drag preview. This all should be working. Our drop data isn't going to be working, but we can test that we can grab it. You can see we can now grab that. It just doesn't work when we try and drop it. Nothing happens. So let's get our drop data. Or let's do our drop data for handling when the item gets dropped. We'll need an item index again. So this is when we're clicking on an inventory slot. This is when we're dropping an item back onto an inventory slot. So we're going to get our own item index. And we're going to say we're going to get our item too. And then we're going to swap items with the item, with the data. Basically, my item index and data dot item index. So what is this doing? This is taking the data's item index, which is where the item that we picked up, where that was before, right? So let's say we pick up a sword. Now there's nothing there. It's null. But maybe we have an item here, or maybe we're null. It doesn't actually matter. We don't care. But let's say we have an item here, like we have a potion. This is going to put that potion where the sword was. And it's going to take the null spot and put that right here. So now we'll be left with a null spot. And I can show you this actually, how this looks. So if we take this shield and we try and drop it on this sword, what's going to happen is it's going to swap this spot with this spot. So this will become null and this will become a sword. And you can see that happened. So we swap the null spot with the sword spot. We swap their locations. And the shield just got forgotten about. And that's not what we want. We want to put the shield here. So that's what we have to do next. We have to say inventory dot set item. And then we call my item index and data dot item. So my item index is the place we're dropping it to, right? Not the place that we got it from. And we'll set it to the item that we have from the drop data. Now if we run, we can see that it now swaps them properly. There you go. Now this doesn't have item stacking. We can't stack these potions. We can't stack these shields. That's a feature that I might want to explore in another video. So we have, a number that displays how many there are. Now there's a bug here, which is if we drag this out into space here, it just gets destroyed. And the solution that I came up for fixing this was to have our inventory container also kind of smart about catching data that gets dropped in it. So this takes up the whole screen, right? The inventory container. So we're going to give it a script and we'll give it two functions. Well, we'll give it access to the inventory. Preload our inventory again. And then we'll say can drop data. And we'll do an underscore under position here because we're not going to use it. And we'll do the same thing we did before. Return data is dictionary and data.has item. So if the data has an item, then yeah, we can drop data here. Now what do we do when we drop that data? Well, we're not going to use position again, but we will use data. Inventory dot set item data dot item index data dot item. So we just set the item back to where it was previously at its old index. Now if we save and run, I don't remember if this works just like this. It doesn't. Now why doesn't it work? Well, it doesn't work because our center container here is actually on top. It takes up the whole screen too, and it's on top of our inventory container here. So we have to go into the mouse settings here, and we have to have this ignore the mouse. So our center container will now ignore the mouse. That allows our inventory container to capture that mouse input. And I think it'll work now. If we drag this off the screen, you can see. Well, I haven't tried dragging it clear off the screen. That doesn't seem to work. So there we go. We've got the basics, dragging and dropping this around. I do think I'd like to make a follow-up video to this. I don't know for sure if I will, honestly, but I would like to. So we'll see how things go. I'd like to make a follow-up video to this because I think it could use a little bit more refining and polishing, but this does give you the general idea for how I do my inventory systems in my games, which is I use data. They're very data oriented. I use resources for each of the items, and I use an inventory resource for that. And then whenever that inventory changes, it then signals out, and whatever UI needs to know will get that signal and update accordingly, update visually accordingly. So that's kind of my system. Hopefully you found this video helpful and you learned something from it. It was a bit of a longer video, but I think it was an interesting one. And it talks about some more advanced techniques and features inside of Godot. And I think those are interesting to cover. So let me know if you enjoyed it. Be sure to like the video and subscribe. I do also want to mention, I mentioned in a community post, but I haven't mentioned here, that my 1-bit Godot course right now I think is $97 off, so it's almost $100 off. You can get the course for much cheaper, and so I'll have a link at the end of this video, a link in the description where you can check out that sale. The sale ends at the end of this month, so it's getting close to an end here. I've had a bunch of people sign up, which has been a little bit more work for me in regards to doing support on Discord, but that's a good thing. That's a good problem to have. I do enjoy doing that support and working students through any questions they might have, even if it's not related to the course sometimes. And so that's a big benefit that you get with the course, is access to my private Discord server for support. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check it out, and I will talk to you all later.